Hello, I'm Claudia Morales, concert producer of concerts from the Library of Congress. And I have my colleague David Plyler. We want to welcome you to our 96th season and invite you to continue following us because the season has just started. Today we have a very special guest, Igor Santos, composer of the new work called Confined Speak for violin and piano, written for Ensemble Daniente members Lin Huang Shu and Wee-Sun Choi, commissioned through the McCain Fund from the Library of Congress. Described as otherworldly and mysteriously familiar with the Chicago Classical Review, and as exciting and clear and striking boldness by Luigi Nono Competition Prize. Igor Santos' music has been performed internationally by leading musicians such as Ensemble Intercontemporanean, Ensemble Dauniente, Ensemble Modern, Alarm Sound, among others. A native from Curitiba, Brazil, Igor is currently based in Chicago, Illinois. In addition to writing culture music, he served as technical director for Ensemble Dauniente and composes for theater production throughout the US and Europe. Welcome, Igor. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Igor, we're so excited to hear your new work that's been commissioned entitled Confined Speak. And I just kind of wanted to get started speaking about that. The name itself is evocative and resonates with the times that we find ourselves in. And I'm wondering if you could just start by telling us a bit about the origins of the work and your process of its composition.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's been, needless to say, a very strange stretch of time for all of us. And I find that for myself, composing during these times is not as easy as maybe I would expect, just given, maybe I'm home more or I having more private time generally for me would mean more creative time, but it wasn't quite the case. And it wasn't like I didn't feel like writing just a piece based on a concept that was outside of my life generally. It just didn't feel right. And so as much as yeah, so the process was just I for a long time over the summer when I was thinking about this piece, I wasn't quite writing. I wasn't really engaging with any creative ideas. It just didn't flow right. And then yeah, until I decided to maybe like, okay, maybe just let's address what's happening in my life now and maybe try to write a piece with that in mind. And that after I did that, the ideas just kind of flowed naturally and just came, and I was able to compose again. Um, yeah, the title Confined Speak is, of course, has to do with confinement, um, in the sense that we're not allowed to have our normal routines. We're not allowed to leave the home as much, although you know f- um, people experience this in different degrees, and different people have different levels of comfort. And I wouldn't say that being quarantined is the most pressing issue for me. I think it was just more of a general sense of confinement in one. Yes, being away from concerts, or being away from normal life. um, but in a second sense, it was also kind of a confinement of expression, of maybe not knowing what to expect next, and not knowing exactly how to proceed with normal things. So it was a confinement in that sense as well. And yeah, please interrupt me if I talk too much and kind of blabber. But yeah, so I was, just generally with the current situation, I've been thinking a lot about art and restraints, and often restraints are like a tool for creativity for artists. And for me, for sure, like whenever I have some kind of constraint about a work, be it either practical constraint like instrumentation, or length of a piece, or a deadline, or whatever, it always like that's the only way I can actually function creatively. um, so I've, with the current quarantine and with all of our situation of everything being remote, I've been thinking a lot about like how can I make this in some way into translate that into music somehow. I've been thinking a lot about constraints in terms of like and looking at history or music history, and seeing what composers have done in the past to address different kinds of constraints.
Oh, great. I was just going to say that I'm so pleased that you said this because that kind of jumped off of the score to me. right away. I was really pleased that you shared your portion of the score with me. I really appreciate that. And because one thing that I noticed right away was that there's this innate tension between this notion of constraint and freedom in the notation itself in particular. For instance, some of the notation was hyperspecific in terms of the layout and how things are synchronously, portrayed. But there's also, and also the ways that you would explain the technical means of achieving a particular sound or something like that. My favorite one was the use of a pictogram with a hand and a credit card in various orientations in order to, how they would, scrape in the piano and whatnot. But at the same time, there are other aspects that were left up very much for the performers to determine, from pitches to the numbers of repeats that might occur within a span of time. So I would love to hear you speak more about that, because I think that this element of constraint and freedom, if you even would think of it in those particular as being poles there, maybe you could say a bit more about that.
Well, I think it's just usually in this case, with the flow of the music, there are sections which are without meter, right, that are more free flowing, and then that contrasts heavily with music that is meter and that's more where the notation is much more precise. And I think one way to talk about that is that generally I work in a musical tableau, or music in blocks. So whenever I switch between block A to block B or back to A, B, going to C, whatever, I try to make each block as contrasting to each other as possible, or at least in the case for this piece, and so while there are sections that are without meter, that's one box or one tableau, and then that shifts to another, which is completely different, which is then metered, which is rhythmic, and which is very specific in terms of what technique is applied at that particular beat. So that's one way that I was thinking about this piece, or
What about the role of gesture? Because it seems like there's not so much gesture in just like a musical gesture, but rather physical gesture that both has it seems to come through in terms of both notation and as one might observe in performance. Is that something that is a factor in your calculation as you're thinking about how these tableaux intersect?
Yeah, I mean, do you mean
like so some of the unspecified types of material that you have sort of evocative notations, like whether they're kind of glissandi type notations that are unclear exactly which pitch or things like that, but or they're directional or different types of things that require a certain, are both visually arresting, but they also require a particular orientation at the piano, say, or on the violin in order to execute. And there's just something compelling about that. And it may just be an offshoot or just a side effect of what you're trying to achieve. So it may not be front and center at all, but it just struck me.
Yeah, I would, the honest answer is that I wasn't really composing gestures in that sense. Although, I mean, I worked on this at a piano in, the Dal Niente studio, actually, because there's a piano there and no one's using it. So, and everything that I write, I tend to play it myself, and so I'm very careful in terms of making it playable and making it comfortable and making it kind of like feel good as you're playing it. Yeah.
Igor, quick question. As you said that, now that you said that as you compose, you're playing the piano, do you, knowing that this piece is for the Ensemble Dal Niente members, did you consult with them, with Winston and
Minh Quan? Yes.
Minh Quan, did you consult with them? What is your creative process for this piece in particular? Do you work hand to hand with the instrumentalists, or do you just give them the final product?
That's a fantastic question, because the Winston and Minkwon, they're virtuoso performer. They're both child prodigies, and whatever they can do on their instrument is, I can't even imagine the things they can actually do. And I've worked with them a few times before. And so, yeah, I always consult with them. And in this case, for this piece, it was always like, for example, recording some video that I made on the piano and sending it to Winston, seeing what he thinks about that, or just texting them and being like, is this technique okay? Like in this case, there's a lot of mutes that I use for the violin. So it's just me understanding, like, if you put the mute here, does that block the sound, or this is just, so I asked Minkwon. And, I've known them for a while, so it's kind of like a comfortable relationship where I can just text them or send a quick email or something like that. But absolutely, yeah. Whenever I work with Winston and Minkwon, I always consult with them as much as I can, really.
Mm-hmm. And knowing that this piece was created during the quote-unquote confinement of these current times, do you also share with them your inspiration or your feeling for the composition, or this is something that just came from you alone?
No, I do share. I do, and it's actually funny because generally I'm not very good about sharing that kind of thing. I just like to keep it about the music, and and if it's about something personal, maybe we'll have it over drinks. But in this case, since we can't, no, yeah, I do. I did share with them the idea, or I didn't actually. I did mention at the very beginning when we had an early meeting about the piece that I was, not really. I didn't really feel like composing that much, and I was I was a little stuck, and I did mention that the only thing I had in mind about the piece that it would be, I wanted a piece that wasn't stressful to put together, in a sense, because everyone's busy, and if you have kids, you're even busier, and I just. And they have kids too, and then so I wanted something that was not stressful on my part and on their part. That was like the first thing that I had in mind, and not stressful in terms of like putting it together or playing it, because they can put together anything very quickly. But it was more that the concept was simple and clear and to everyone, and it wasn't something that was kind of mystified and distant. That was just an early general idea that I had about the piece.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing the piece, and I'm sure it'll be nice to hear the video. We're going to be premiering it virtually, but we're of course looking forward to hearing it live at some point as well. We're looking forward to the day when we can do that. So Igor, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would like to say about this particular piece before we move on to speak about some of your other music.
Yeah, just the only thing I wanted to mention that I was talking a little bit on the beginning is I find it interesting to address our current situation in a creative way. And, I was thinking a lot about like John Cage and, for example, his prepared piano music, which was born out of a certain constraint itself, being that he wanted this piece for percussion ensemble to be played at this university. And then they didn't have, I don't remember if they didn't have space or the performers for it. And he ended up doing a percussion piece played on the piano, on the prepared piano. And that ended up being something that after that particular event was over, something that continued on, and I've just been thinking about all of like how we rehearse on Zoom or how everything that of our current situation, how that can be transformed into a positive way, and that can maybe even keep going after we return to normal, so to speak. Anyway, so I think this is just a little contribution in thinking about that.
Do you think that it would allow for a greater openness to remote collaborations, things like that? Is that kind of what you mean, or just more like actual new types of artistic impulses that might be?
Yeah, I think both. I think both, and I think the remote stuff. I've seen some. I gave this masterclass for a friend at a friend's university in Thailand, and the students were all working with writing pieces to be performed and rehearsed over Zoom. So they took into account like the delay time of audio, and all this stuff. So I think this is interesting that we're adapting in creative ways to the current situation. And for myself, it was not so much of a technical kind of adaptation as it was conceptual, you know. And,
Sure.
yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure to get to know some of your other music too, just in as the library commissioned you and during that process. And one thing I would love to hear you speak about, it seems to me that there's a recurring theme in your music that is speech or speech representation or singing without necessarily involving vocal utterances. And I'm thinking of words like speak through speaking, parlando, murmurations, through thoughts of a different kind, the voice carves its line. I'm sure there are other ones that that you have that might have this kind of component to it. One particularly compelling example is speaking through speaking, as it involves the manipulation of yourself reading a sentence as portrayed by a trio of musicians. And just because of this, the name of your new work has the word speak in it as well, that struck me as kind of a through line of sorts. And so I'm wondering if maybe you can say a few things about explorations along these lines. If I'm even, I don't know if that's I don't want to inaccurately portray, something that you're doing either. So correct me too.
No, I think that's 100% accurate. And on my end, I think it was something that just happened naturally for me. It wasn't like planned that all these pieces would be somehow based on voice or the idea of speaking or the idea of that kind of communication. But well, I think for me, it just has to do with. I think most of my music of the last, I would say, like 5 years, have had something to do with mimesis, or the idea of imitating the real world through sound. And so that is one. I'm kind of really interested in a direct way of communicating as an artist. And what does that mean for me is just somehow evoking in the listener some kind of memory from the outside world, and this imitation of the real world in some way is an important concept for me. Recently, I wrote this piece for Ensemble Moderne that was my last real live performance in March, and the whole piece was about was using a sampler that played sounds from the real world, several of them, and the ensemble is just doubling the whole time. That was the most extreme version of this kind of thinking. And I think the idea for me is that I like to bring very direct and recognizable objects into my music, and speeches, perhaps the most important one. So yeah, that's
Interesting.
Go ahead, Claudia.
Igor, when speaking about your music and your creative process, when you write, do you write thinking about what you want your audience to feel or to react, how you want them to react to what you are composing, or do you compose from your own point of view solely?
I think it's both ways.
Mhm.
Ideally, I would like to say I don't think about an audience at all, but that's 100% not true. I don't assume that there is one perfect listener that's going to hear everything that I do in exactly the way that I meant it to be, but I do think about these things, or I do keep into account some kind of like empathetic way of writing, being like incorporating either memories that come from the outside world, so for example, imitation of real world sound, stuff that everyone can kind of viscerally react to or identify with. And I also, within pieces, I try to create memories from within, so to speak. So in that case, repetition being one. If I have a very complex block of sound, I'll repeat it, and depending on the complexity of that sound, that gets repeated more, so that you can both hear it, inside more carefully as it repeats, or if it comes back as a refrain somehow, that also, it's kind of like you can recontextualized or presented in some way like that. So yeah, I do think about how a listener will experience the piece, at least sorry, I'm kind of like thinking as I'm speaking. Yes, I do think about it, but it's not like a primary concern, and I don't assume there's a single perfect list. Yeah.
You know that there's a couple of interesting things that come out of what you're just saying. One is that the extreme version with the Ensemble Moderne piece in terms of the mimetic, like literal associations that's happening between recorded sound and live performance. That, if I understood that correctly, that's what's going on. That there's a sort of didactic component there where the audience is kind of in on what is happening, and so therefore can participate in a particular way that they may not be able to. I guess that would be a question for ones that are not quite as explicit as that. Is that relationship between real world and and kind of invented world, one that is very important for the audience to have and again, not to speak of this monolithic audience, but is it important for them to have this access to it? Because I think again of that the piece where you're speaking through speaking, where the concept is kind of laid out pretty clearly, but the development of it kind of goes in a lot of different ways that are not expected, at least not to me.
Mm-hmm. No, sure, yeah. So that's a piece that's from 2017, and as you said, the source of the piece is a transcription of my own speech, and really, I could have read the text in any number of ways, right? And it could have been just any melody that you would come up with. It didn't have to be a transcription. My answer to that is, I think the way I'm describing this, mimesis in my music and how it relates to real world sounds and empathize with an audience it's a more recent development, and it's something that came from just looking at my older works and being like, oh, what was driving me to write this piece here, and trying to really think, why did I have to use a transcription of my own voice? Why is that interesting to me? And so it's something that I think now I address more directly, but back when I was writing that piece, I wasn't that aware and wasn't particularly thinking in these terms. So even with Claudia's question, back then I would say I wasn't thinking about how the listener would experience this at all. But now I do. And so, for example, in my newest piece, there is some like imitations of speech, so to speak, that are also kind of like abstract. It's not something that, anyone would know beforehand what that speech was, but I do present it in such a way, like I present the pre-recorded thing first, and then I have the instruments imitate that right after, so that you've heard it already and you hear that relationship. So it's a very good question, and I'm still kind of developing these concepts, and I'm not trying to codify a particular technique for myself.
Sure.
But it's just it's becoming more clear to me now that how I'm approaching sound and material.
Another thing that's interesting about that is that in addition to this this component of the mimetic, there's you also mentioned that the role of repetition and I'm just assuming then memory in terms of what that role is in the presentation of a work. And one other thing that I notice about a lot of your music is that there's a kind of a heightened sense of musical rhetoric, and I mean that in a good way, where there's things are happening quite dramatically, perhaps, and then suddenly the music will get stuck, and so you're feeling like you're moving along and we're going with you, and then suddenly we're there, and we can't get out of it, but it kind of forces a sort of self-reflection, at least for me as an audience member. And I find that to be a very compelling thing, and I'm almost like a sort of a mechanical type of repetition that then gets unstuck and then moves on in different ways. Is there anything else you want to say about that, or is that inaccurate? Sort of?
No, yeah, you have very good ears. That's exactly it. I mean, this is as far as I can remember, my music has always been linear, and or rhetorical, as you mentioned, you know. And I think once I found once I started using repeats or loops in my pieces, I found that I could create a more dynamic through line, you know. And as you mentioned, you know, as the music keeps going, it can get stuck and can unstuck. You can work a lot with predictability and unpredictability with so yeah, repetition is a tool for that kind of, to create a more dynamic, formal rhetoric, I suppose.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Igor, knowing that you are originally from Curitiba, Brazil, I'm curious to know two things: whether your original country has any influence, inspiration in your compositions, and two, if you have or are looking into having any artistic relationship with South America, in particular with Brazil.
Yeah. Last year I had a piece released on a CD in Brazil, an electronic music group from Curitiba, from my city. And I do keep in touch with some composers there and friends who are musicians, outside even of, you know, contemporary classical music world. I never formally studied there, other than in high school. I took some theory classes at the local conservatory. Um, but I do, yeah, I do sort of keep in touch with some composers and musicians there, especially in Curitiba, my city. Whether Brazil affects my music, I don't know that I can speak to that directly. I don't think about it in that way. Um, it probably does. I mean, a lot of my listening tends to be, you know, like Brazilian popular music, and I also play guitar. That's how I started as a musician, you know, and I play a lot of popular music on guitar and all this stuff, and I think that probably does affect me in some way. Um, yeah, I used to joke that the most Brazilian thing about my music was that no matter how hard I try, it's always a little sentimental. Um, but that's, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But I think, yeah, I'm sure it does in ways that I probably can't speak to very clearly.
You know, one quick follow-up on that. You mentioned other types of music, and in addition to your concert music, you also do. My understanding is that you also do work for theatrical productions, and
Yeah,
yeah, maybe you could talk about that a little bit, or
yeah, sure. I've been, you know, since college, I've been doing incidental music for plays, and sometimes sound design as well, meaning like the sound effects that happen in a play. And that was because in undergrad, I uh, entered this relationship with this director. His name was David Frankel. He passed away recently. But we, yeah, we just kind of got along. You know, he would ask me to write original music for his plays, and they tended to be like early 20th century dramas. That was the and either that or maybe more recent dramas that had some kind of like scientific um, inspiration about them. And yeah, so I think maybe since 2016, I've been a resident composer for his theater company and working on maybe like 4 or 5 plays every year.
oh wow,
Yeah, and it was a fun gig. I mean, now, you know, theater is taking a break. Um, and this particular director, he passed, and so I still continue a relationship with the theater company. But yeah, I've always enjoyed it, and it's very different from the work in you know, writing contemporary classical, in the sense that, or in the new music field, because in the sense that when you're writing for a play, you're providing a service, and in that sense, I really enjoyed it. I found it to be less pressure creatively sometimes, you know, and this kind of like, it has to work for a specific, music has to work for a specific scene, and has to match the director's vision in some way, and I kind of like that back and forth, you know, of writing, getting feedback, and revising. It's a very dynamic way of working.
well, Claudia, I was thinking, unless you have another question, maybe we could just ask Igor what is kind of on the horizon right now in terms of new projects, and maybe end there.
Sounds great.
Yeah, so after I finish this piece, I'm writing a viola and cello duo for some friends in Chicago. And other than that, I have this. Yeah, I have a lot of my pieces. Have when I was doing my PhD at University of Chicago, had to do with electronics, and specifically with this what I, for lack of a better term, call meta instruments, which is just combining electronics and with an acoustic instrument and kind of blending them to create something else. And I have this particular setup for microtonal writing that I like on keyboards, and I've been planning this piece for 5 keyboards for a while. And I might get started on that. That's with Ensemble Doniente people as well. Mabel Kwan is the person that I originally wanted to write this for. So it's a piece that I've been wanting to write for a long time, and slowly getting to that.
So does it involve multiple types of tuning systems, or is it kind of like the Ives quarter tone piano piece, the two pianos that are tuned a quarter tone apart, or like what is it? Different types of tuning systems, or what? Are you
Yeah,
just
so I just kind of created the setup where as I'm playing, I can shift between any tuning that I want. So it's a hybrid system.
Oh,
and
cool.
So within one piece, I usually change it into how many tuning systems I need and so forth. So it has a lot to do with tuning, but it also has to do with just doing just a kind of exchanging instruments in different ways. So for example, as much as, if I have a piano sound that I'm playing that's set up in a certain way, I consider that one type of estrangement. But another one is like playing the piano with the pitch bend wheel, and so changing the sound of the piano in that way. So doing things like that, never getting away from the original instrumental sound, but always defamiliarizing it in different ways.
Well, that's so exciting. We're looking forward very much to hearing your piece, and of course, wish you all the luck. And thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for the commission.
Thank you,
it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.